Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Today, we're going to remain on the topic of the European Union, but specifically, we're going to move our focus to the defence industry. Europe has recently learnt a vital lesson at the hands of Donald Trump, and that's that you can't rely on other nations for your own security. Now that the US security umbrella in Europe is no more, Europe has to determine its own military and security future. The war in Ukraine has made Europe especially aware of the consequences of not having the capabilities to defend itself. And so this pursuit towards individual security will involve dramatic changes, especially with conflict in the modern day being so hybrid in nature. Outside of Ukraine, other flashpoints also remain, such as infrastructure warfare in the Baltic Sea and political flashpoints that lead to vetoes between members of the European Union. Europe will have goals that it wants to achieve in this new era of European rearmament, but this pursuit won't occur without hiccups. So today, I'm going to ask some big questions. Firstly, I'll ask what issues Europe will potentially have to contend with as it heads down this road to rearmament. And secondly, I'm going to explore if Europe even has the capabilities to achieve any of these goals in the first place. Let's dive in. So when we look at the European Union, 23 members of the EU are also members of NATO. So to begin, I'm going to explore the percentages of gross domestic product these nations spend on defence. To access the full data set that includes the defence spending of all NATO members, you can head over to Substack. That image is included in the blog post over there. So a key motivation for wanting to discuss percentages of gross domestic product spent on defence and military spending is that Trump has been pushing for NATO members to hit 5% of gross domestic product spending on defence. Some nations in the EU are already well on their way to 5%, while some others are lagging behind. So from the dataset, I'm going to pick out some of the key points of discussion before we then look more to the future and the goals that Europe will want to achieve in their rearmament process. So firstly, in 2024, the highest percentage of gross domestic product spent on defence by a NATO country was Poland, who spent 4.1% of gross domestic product on defence. Poland is rapidly emerging as a geopolitical power and a leader in Europe. They border both Ukraine and Belarus, and so the consequences of the war in Ukraine are a direct issue that they have to contend with. In this power-based world order that Trump has accelerated the progress towards, we see that power recognises power, and as a result, military strength recognises military strength, and possessing such strength will be a clear and active deterrent against aggression. This is one such aspect of European defence that Poland has recognised before anybody else, and they are well on their way to 5% of gross domestic product being spent on defence. But this figure isn't important. The important aspect here is that Poland is in a position to defend itself and to deter aggression against it, regardless of what figure is being spent on defence. This trend of a high percentage of gross domestic product being spent on defence is also seen in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Estonia spends 3.4% of GDP on defence. Latvia spends 3.2% of GDP on defence, and Lithuania spends 2.9%. This places Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the top 6 of NATO members and the percentage of gross domestic product that they spend on defence. The other two countries in the top 6 are the United States with 3.4% of GDP spent on defence and Greece with 3.1%. When it comes to the Baltics, they are also involved and connected to Russia and the war in Ukraine. Estonia and Latvia border Russia itself, and Lithuania borders Belarus and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. But the Baltics aren't only motivated to spend a large amount of gross domestic product on defence due to their land border with Russia. The larger percentages of defence spending that we see here are also driven by moves in the Baltic Sea. For years, we've seen the battlefields of modern war expand and grow more hybrid in nature. And in the Baltic Sea, infrastructure war is common and frequent. The most significant event was the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline in September 2022. But since then, we've seen data cables, fibre optic cables, and communication cables frequently cut. And this has been seen not just against the Baltic states, but also the Scandinavian nations and against Russia as well. For more details on this topic, if you once again head over to Substack, on the 24th of February this year, I published a post that dove into more detail on undersea warfare in the Baltic Sea. The final country that I feel like I have to discuss as a part of this discussion surrounding gross domestic product spent on defence is the United States itself. Now, since Trump re-entered the Oval Office, he has been pulling back from Europe, and this has triggered a rearmament movement within Europe. Trump has called for 5% of gross domestic product spent from European nations and NATO nations on defence. And Trump's threats to pull back support, especially for Ukraine, has taught the Europeans that they have to be responsible for their own necessities and their own security. If we focus specifically on the United States, when the United States confiscated Russian foreign exchange reserves that are held in dollars at the start of the Ukraine invasion, the US started the slow, decade-long de-dollarization process. Again, as I've stated before, this de-dollarization process isn't going to unfold overnight. It's going to take decades. But this action that the United States took in confiscating FX reserves, whether seen as a good move or a bad move, it changed attitudes around the world towards the dollar. This especially changed attitudes towards the dollar from adversaries of the United States, but it also changed attitudes of allies and friends of the United States. With the United States withdrawing its security umbrella, a similar trend has unfolded where they have started the slow decline of the US's role as global military policeman. Again, this could have positive or negative results. It will likely have both. But even if in the future the United States enacts a different strategy under a different president, the attitudes and the lessons learnt in Europe will remain. Europe won't rely on external support for security again. But an ironic and small caveat here. If Europe is to expand its military power and accelerate its rearming process and strategy, to purchase military assets and weapons, Europe will likely have to turn to the United States because they possess the most technologically advanced military equipment. So, in the short term, Trump has enacted a strategy where his only option is to win because he has raised demand for US weaponry. However, if one day in the future Europe does manage to establish its own extensive military supply chains and manufacturing, the United States will suffer in the long term from reduced weapon sales. So, for the United States, this is a short-term gain for long-term pain, which is a clear sign of a declining empire focused on short-term fixes rather than long-term growth. So, the European defence industry is clearly experiencing its biggest shake-up since the end of the Cold War. Flashpoints are emerging, internal tension exists, and centuries of history imply that Russia and Europe could once again be set to clash. As we look forward, what could Europe's goals be? And in the pursuit of these goals, what will be the biggest issues that Europe will have to navigate? So, in determining Europe's goals here, in its pursuit of rearmament and of its own security, I've determined that Europe will be in pursuit of 4 key goals. These will be strategic autonomy, innovation, cooperation, and expanded manufacturing. Now, to touch quickly on each of these 4 goals, firstly discussing strategic autonomy. France has been a huge promoter of European sovereignty in defence, with Macron pushing quite frequently for the formation of an EU army. In recent years, Germany has also been more vocal about EU defence independence. Now, this would involve the EU producing and procuring its own defence equipment, ammunition, cyber tools, and communication systems to end dependence on US systems such as F-35s. This will require raw materials such as rare earths and semiconductors, which, as we've discussed in these last few episodes, centering around the European Union, these are industries where the EU clearly lags behind the United States and China. Next, moving on to innovation, and the European Defence Fund has pledged €8 billion between 2021 and 2027 to support defence research and development within the EU. This includes drones, AI, cybersecurity, and communication systems. The EU Cyber Solidarity Act also aims to protect institutions and critical infrastructure, as well as to bolster a collective response among EU member states. This EU Cyber Solidarity Act is also linked to elections, where information manipulation was seen to affect some elections in 2024, especially in Romania, where we saw the TikTok campaign boost a relatively unknown candidate to the top of the polls. A final element of EU innovation in defence is occurring in space. They sit quite a distance behind the United States and China once again here, but they are attempting to build a satellite constellation to rival Starlink, which is called Iris. Then protecting these assets in space will also be a trend that we will see drive the future of defence. Next, we have cooperation. The EU possesses over 60 joint military projects, including cyber rapid response teams, drone swarms, and collective medical command. Could this be translated into operational changes of cooperation, or will pursuits remain fragmented by individual countries and their national interests? This is a vital question that the EU will have to tackle across all industries, not just defence. Will collective interests be more important than national interests, or will national interests prevail and set the EU project up for failure? I will speak to this question in the defence industry today, but this question will also re-emerge as over the next few weeks I delve deeper into the more psychological side of the European Union and specifically explore the purpose of the EU. Back to defence now, and the final goal that the European Union would want is expanded manufacturing. Now, the EU has faced low stockpiles and dependence on US systems for years. So the focus with expanded manufacturing would be to build stockpiles and increase production. This also ties into cooperation, with the EU hoping to incentivise joint procurement, especially munitions, air defence and drone production. So, we've now established some goals that Europe will hope to pursue in this rearmament process. But we still have many key issues to navigate if this rearmament is to be seen as successful. Now, let's dive into these issues. The first issue that Europe will have to contend with is that many flashpoints still remain across the continent. Now, these don't even have to be military flashpoints, they could be political, as we see with Hungary, where they veto many votes, especially surrounding aid to Ukraine, for example. The future of NATO and Trump's aggressive stance against the alliance will also lead Europe to seek a parallel defence structure that can act independently from NATO and the United States. The EU will also want to manage stability on its periphery, which involves many of these flashpoint areas such as the Black Sea, the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Mediterranean. Next issue that we have to contend with here once again brings up the topic of collective interests versus national interests. The success of collective EU defence would depend on political unity, not just on military spending. As I mentioned, we see tensions remain here as countries veto defence decisions due to their national interests. EU-wide planning will see some countries develop quicker than others in this rearmament process, which will further bring the collective versus individual self-interest questions into the limelight. As a result, the EU needs a political command structure that suits the collective strategy of all member states. Of course, this is easier said than done, but with the sheer number of states here and the fact that the veto strategy can slow decision making, something needs to be done here to streamline this process. Next, we have internal tensions that the EU will have to navigate. The EU is currently struggling with migration today and will continue to in the future. The European Border and Coast Guard Agency work to provide coordinated surveillance, returns, and rapid response. But the changes here in migration are leading to some nations reintroducing border checks. This rising tension will require large police forces in EU nations to potentially have to navigate internal tension. Currently, Cyprus, Greece, Croatia, Malta, and Portugal lead in the number of police per capita in Europe. Next, we can focus on raw military numbers from country to country and military assets from country to country, while also exploring these numbers collectively. With flashpoints emerging, the EU will need an increased military presence, especially in the Baltic Sea. This will involve patrols, but it could also involve digital solutions to monitor undersea cables, pipelines, data cables, LNG terminals, and energy assets such as offshore wind farms. The EU is planning to address some of this issue by incorporating a 5,000 troop rapid deployment force by the end of this year. On a country-to-country basis of raw troops, France has 270,000 active troops, Poland has 114,000, Germany has 180,000, Italy 165,000, and Spain 120,000 active troops. Collectively, this could see the EU have as many as 1.5 million active duty troops, while also having 2.33 million in reserves. Focusing on military assets, and collectively, Europe has over 6,000 tanks, over 25,000 armoured vehicles, and 11,000 artillery pieces. Focusing on aerial assets, they have 2,500 combat aircraft and 822 attack helicopters. The EU is also in possession of around 50 submarines. Its naval assets see the EU lag behind the United States, but collectively, especially with ground assets, the EU possesses large military strength with great potential if it could coordinate this effectively. The next issue is Russia looming to the east. Russia's fears of European expansion are rooted in historical examples such as Napoleon in 1812 and Hitler in 1941. Now, we can believe this Russian fear is fact or fiction, but this narrative that Russia wants to plug security gaps and expand its buffer zone is the narrative that Russia is using to support its pursuits, especially its aggressive pursuits as we're seeing in Ukraine. On the flip side of this, during the period of the Iron Curtain, many EU states of today remember decades of life under Soviet coercion and occupation. So, this pits the EU's military presence on Russia's borders against the recent Russian military expansion that we've been seeing. Since both deem the other as a threat, with the EU seemingly pursuing more expansion and Russia not incentivized to stop its fighting in Ukraine because it's winning, does this mean that the EU and Russia remain on a collision course? I'd say it does, but with war becoming more hybrid in nature, this doesn't necessarily translate to a hot war between Russia and Europe. This could be fought in the cyber realm, or in infrastructure sabotage, or in energy warfare. And in fact, it likely already is being fought in these realms, but in ways that we cannot easily see. New developing technologies such as AI, drone warfare, and satellite intelligence will also be key trends in the future of a potential conflict here. An issue that I've referred to in previous episodes is Europe's fiscal position. A few months ago, the EU stated that it would spend 800 billion euros on defence. My question is, where does Europe find this money from? The fragmented fiscal spending in Europe will disrupt the rearmament process because fiscal spending occurs on a nation-to-nation level. The EU does have the European Defence Fund with a budget of 1.12 billion euros on an annual basis, but spending today remains nationally focused. As a result of this, spending is uneven. For example, Germany recently passed a law to exempt defence spending from their strict debt rules, some of which are EU-wide policies, such as debt being no higher than 60% of gross domestic product. But some nations aren't in a position to spend because of high debt to GDP percentages. On a continent-wide basis, if the European Union is to spend this much money, it will likely need trade-offs and huge levels of cooperation. In the episode on fiscal policy a few weeks ago, I discussed some strategies such as increased borrowing via Euro bonds or defence-specific bonds, defence-based taxes or carbon levies could also be used to redirect funds to defence spending. Regardless of whatever strategies Europe does pursue, the most important thing is that they need to be coordinated in doing it. This will be difficult, and this highlights the fiscal fragmentation and different debt profiles of EU member states. This, in my opinion, is one of the biggest barriers to an efficient and productive EU rearmament process. Next, speaking of productivity and efficiency, the European Union has to reduce choice. What I mean by this is that there are currently 17 types of tanks in the EU, whereas the United States has one. This needs to change, otherwise individual defence pursuits and fragmented spending will leave Europe behind, while other geopolitical actors undergo more streamlined, productive and efficient processes. Finally, this isn't particularly an issue, but it could be an opportunity for the European Union. EU defence might not have to be about sheer force. It could be smarter. Could strategies such as rapid troop relocation, joint logistics, intelligence fusion, or cyber dominance increase the EU's strategic depth? If Europe sees a boost in resilience, mobility, and predictive capability through early warning systems and AI simulation, this could be seen as a deterrent. This would involve the EU successfully navigating the hybrid range of threats that we see in war today, such as conventional war, cyber threats, space threats, infrastructure sabotage, and economic, financial, and trade weaponization. As war becomes non-linear, the EU's efforts must also adapt and expand and become hybrid in nature along with it. If the EU can be smart here, they could deter through military smartness rather than sheer military force. So, with those potential issues, it's now worth looking forward to some of the bigger questions that the EU will have to face over the coming years. The biggest question that I believe collects all of these points together is, can the European Union truly build an independent, coordinated defence industry? Or are they merely attempting to navigate a world without American guarantees? If we focus specifically on today, does the EU have any cards to play? Based on their previous reliance on other nations, especially the United States, are they always set to be negotiating into weakness for now? It is clear that Europe still needs the United States today, especially for military assets if they are to rearm. And so, if they are to want to trade military assets for the United States, what would Europe have to give up in return? This could just end up being a good deal between the two, since Trump does want to increase US manufacturing. But the power is in Trump's hands here and the hands of the United States. Europe is playing along to their tune rather than playing its own. Another aspect where Europe is weakened and where it relies on other nations is energy. As I discussed in Monday's episode, one day in the future, Europe could be a leader in green energy. But today, the reality is that some countries in Europe have been closing down nuclear power plants, and others are relying too heavily on renewables and experience blackouts. We saw this back in April when a major blackout occurred across the Iberian Peninsula, affecting Spain and Portugal. Findings from an investigation into this blackout highlighted that European power grids need improved resiliency. Now, this is an area where Europe has potential for cooperation, and this cooperation could see its energy sectors become more advanced than other geopolitical actors. This is because the European project has unique advantages in its energy sector, such as interconnectors, but they are yet to leverage this collective advantage. Europe needs baseload power via a nuclear build-out across a number of countries, not a rejection of nuclear power. They also need reliable access to natural gas. This could come from Ukraine if they weren't embroiled in war. Other options outside of this are the Middle East via Turkey, but EU-Turkey tensions do spike from time to time, especially over previous Turkish attempts to gain EU membership. This was a move that many EU nations, especially France, wholeheartedly rejected. The final and best option for Europe is to receive natural gas from the United States. Especially with the gas transit deal with Ukraine and Russia cancelled at the beginning of 2025, some countries in Europe may have to once again find supplies from alternative sources. As the biggest crude oil and natural gas player in the world, eyes here would naturally turn to the United States, which is expanding its export capabilities with new projects currently. So, Europe needs the United States in the defence sector, but they also need them in the energy realm. So, despite this split that we are seeing between Europe and the United States, Trump knows that the United States has multiple cards it can play because the EU, for now, has to negotiate with the United States. So, this is not a matter of how or why future deals between the two will occur. It's a matter of when. Otherwise, the EU will face great pain as it adapts in this new world. However, looking forward, the seeds have been sown. Europe is in pursuit of rearmament, and the evidence is clear that Europe is committed to heading down this road. The success or failure of these pursuits will be told with time, but the direction of travel is clear, and Europe will maintain its momentum here. That's all for today. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.